Now, like, if chicks don't respond to me, like, a lot of chicks want to fuck me, but the reason they don't is because they're nervous, you know, the whole celebrity status. I'm not good enough, that's a YouTube celebrity. A lot of women feel insecure about dating me because I have so many fans. Yes!
What a pleasant and relatable human being that was.
아, 이거는 못 고르지.
Oh, you're just insecure. Anyways, it's episode 181 of Radio Free Innsmouth, and we're doing something a little bit like episode 179, where I just looked through, like, all the wacky fucking CDs I have and fucking, like, picked one out.
Fucking, like, dude, to be honest, you know, here's the thing.
That I thought you, the folks at home, can I call you folks?
안 골라, 이건. 포기, 패스.
Might find interesting, because this is a band that I honestly haven't heard anybody really talk about at all, and I think they're pretty cool. The name of this band is Rosicrucian. They are from Svadia, and they play some kind of wacky thrash, but there's quite a bit more to it than that. To properly place them in their historical context, we are going to have to talk about Metallica. Now, I know this is a topic that's pretty fraught with controversy. You know, the whole Lars never uses the ride symbol. They're just a diamond head knockoff that happened to get lucky versus they're the most important metal band of all time. You know, there's like the hardline, I guess you call them like Metallica denialists, who will be like, actually, Overkill put a demo out in 1979, so they're the first thrash metal band. And then there's people that really go a little bit too hard with the Metallica fellatio. Personally, I find myself as something of a radical centrist on the subject.
Hey, that's pretty gay.
Like, a lot of times I see them as being a little bit overrated. I don't really listen to them that much anymore, but at the same time, they were a formative part of my musical development, and they have done, you know, a decent amount of good for the genre. Speaking of formative musical development, when I was a kid, I remember I had Ride the Lightning, and I loved that album, and I think the next Metallica album I got was Load, and I got it, and I hated it, so I'm just like sitting around moping, and my dad comes up, he's like,
"Hey little fella, why you so sad?"
And then I'm just like,
man, I love this Metallica band, and I got this Metallica album, and it just, like, it sounds like stuff you hear on the radio.
And he's like,
"Well, son, sounds like what happened to your Metallica band here is they sold out."
And that was a pretty important part of my development as an asshole musical elitist. Had he known what sort of monster I would eventually turn into, he might have held his tongue, but indirectly we do have Metallica to thank for this program. But as far as Rosicrucian goes, we have to talk about Metallica in terms of musical development, because they started out
Fucking, like,
playing this sort of new wave of British heavy metal, speed metal adjacent type stuff, and then
yeah, like some, like,
they got really neoclassical by their third album. They started incorporating a lot more clean parts and harmonies and whatnot, and it often led into these like really heavy, slightly down-tuned percussive chugs. That would be pretty important later on, and it would eventually lead to,
I don't know, like,
And Justice for All, my personal favorite Metallica album, which was heavy on these sort of percussive riffs that also happened to be very melodic and structured, not really just like retard chugs. But this was a big influence on just kind of metal in general.
Fucking, I don't know, fucking...
And then we know what happened to Metallica after that, alright? I don't need to go over it. Suffice to say, massive disappointment. Not from a sales perspective, but I haven't enjoyed anything they've done since Injustice. There's always some fucking ding-dong out there trying to be like, "Hey man, the new album's them going back to thrash metal."
Oh, fuck yeah! Shit!
Like, you know how many way better thrash metal bands I could find just like lifting up a rock than whatever the hell new Metallica's doing? I don't give a fuck, dude. And Rosicrucian might be an example of one of those. But getting back to Metallica's musical development, the whole like that mostly came into mainstream culture as like new metal and fucking groove metal chug nonsense. Yeah, no, we don't like any of that. But another big part of that And Justice for All album with the chugs was that the chugs were in service to like some very like neoclassically musically influenced, complexly structured songs. So then the question is, why didn't more bands pick up on like that aspect of it? Well, imagine, if you will, a world in where that did happen, which yeah, it did actually happen. It's called the late 80s and early 90s in thrash, before death metal kind of took over. You had bands like Overkill on the Years of Decay album, or like Heathen's second album, even more obscure bands like Dementia from Onalaska, Wisconsin. Lots of bands picking up on like that more percussive angle, and eventually that would lead to like Meshuggah, who started out very Metallica influenced and sort of just like ran with that chugs and the whole prog thing. But another band that came out of sort of like this alternate universe of metal would be Rosicrucian, who are probably the most interesting response to late 80s Metallica that I can think of, and it's a damn shame they're not more well known. I can only think it's just because of like record distribution and stuff being out of print, because they came out on Black Mark Records, so like that shit's all gonna be spendy to get now. Their first album, entitled Silence, doesn't start out that strange. This sounds like pretty normal turn of the 80s into the 90s, like slightly more towards the brutal end of thrash.
Fucking like, you know, like some like...
And it's good stuff for what it is. Definitely Metallica influence going on there, with these like pretty, you know, fast to mid-paced sort of chuggy bits. You know, it's catchy, it's brutal, it's well produced, but it's going to lead into a very strange extrapolation of Metallica's sound. You might not hear it now, but this band is big on tempo changes and full stops. In fact, I think we are about to run into one right about now. Vocals are going to get pretty interesting here. They start out very death metal influenced, and they go into thrash metal gang shouts. So that's an interesting artifact of the time. But here we're getting into like the meat and potatoes of the album, which are these groove riffs that are not like dumb groove riffs. They have a lot going on in them, like these weird little sliding chords, but that's just the beginning of it. More death metal stuff coming in here, mixed with the gang shouts. See? Weird sort of crossing over of genres. Going back into more normal mid-paced stuff. Thought this was a nice little like sort of staircase thrash riff climbing back up into these mid-paced riffs, which have a lot of space between them. You could just do a chug like they're doing now, but they're going to insert a lot of weird stuff into the space. Like this kind of weird, what is that, a keyboard or something? I don't know, maybe a weird guitar distortion. Weird keyboards, layered synths, all kinds of strange stuff.
I'm hearing a lot of strange stuff.
Back into a more normal Metallica-ish version of that riff, but it's gonna get even stranger. Check this shit out, man. It's good stuff. You think this might just be novelty seeking, but it's actually an important part of their sound. In fact, there's so much negative space they can put this weird stuff into, leading into this solo that kind of weaves its way in and out of this chug riff that is also subtly evolved. It started out just like dun-dun-dun-dun, but now it's doing this weird bendy bit. I don't know, there's lots of interesting stuff going on with this album, and I'm a big fan of it. It gets very, very neoclassical, even more so than what you already heard later on in the album. Like this song right here, it goes downright like Yngwie intro-ish. Very Black Star. This sort of like classical guitar type shit going on. That's pretty interesting. Leading into a little bit of shredding. Here's a total Yngwie bit. And then this goes into... You'd think that'd be a hard stop, but no, that clean guitar is still there, kind of weaving in and out of the riffs. It's an interesting way of stitching those two rather disparate parts together. Very prog. And then these like lurching riffs. Heavy on groove, this album definitely. It also helps that it's produced like in a very heavy manner. Quite a bit more bass to it than Injustice for All. This is a cool riff. This almost sounds like something Mithras would do in their first album on that like Wrath of God song. An effective balance between very hard-hitting thrash riffs with these like weirder sort of proggy semi-off time bits. Lots of good transition. Speaking of which, total death metal right here. This sounds like something off of a Pestilence album, and it fits right in with the rest of their sound. This is very much like the bleeding edge of how heavy thrash can be before it turns into just straight up death metal. So I'm a big fan of that first album. Could they keep it going on their second?
Let's find out.
Well, there's still plenty of clean guitar this time around. Accenting the end of each musical phrase with these bits of chugging. Then here's a weird little transition. Lots of weird transitions in this band.
Gay!
Not like that! The thicker bass sound gets to breathe a lot more during these like quieter moments, which I appreciate. But don't you worry, we are building up to something heavy. Right about now. There isn't as much death metal on this album, particularly in the vocals that you're going to hear in a minute, but it's still within kind of that same realm of heaviness. I guess you could say the songwriting is a bit more concise, especially with those death metal elements being removed, but it's also maybe a slightly more progressive album. You're going to hear right now stuff like this, and also the ways the vocals are going to go, possibly an influence from the band Coroner. Lots of weird, like, rolling drum fills. Here's the Coroner part. Even with some spooky cyber voice, we like that.
What about ghosts?
Also on this album, there's a bit more keyboard work. I mean, it was there on the first album, but there was used for accents. Here it's actually worked more into the riff proper. You can hear it in the background a bit right now. Sort of doubling up on what the lead guitar is doing. Very headbangable mosh part right here. Weird bendy prog thrash stuff. Strange guitars weaving in and out of each other. It's pretty standard for progressive thrash metal. Maybe not as unique as their first album, but still well worth getting if you enjoyed that one. This almost sounds like something you hear on Edge of Sanity's Crimson album, that weird kind of clean guitar in the background there, playing these spooky, weird dissonant chords. Apart from the groove aspect, I think one of the most notable aspects of this band is how they weave in this like weird lead guitar between the notes. And plenty of this brutal sort of like death metal adjacent thrash metal type stuff. While his voice isn't as all over the place on this album, it's perhaps a bit more refined, which is nice, although I do miss the death metal interjection. And there is a high quality mosh riff. I like the weird little full stops with the little accents, like this one. Really offsets the blast beats quite nicely. Lots of spooky stuff, more keyboard back in there, which we enjoy. And yeah, no, the second album, not as like crazy and unique and groundbreaking as the first, but still an enjoyable album. Speaking of the title of that album, No Cause for Celebration, after this, the band broke up. Oh, no! Sort of. It's kind of complicated, and there's conflicting stories on this. So if you're like me, you probably have Daniel Ekeroth's book, Swedish Death Metal, which features, well, first of all, it features like him just being completely retarded and demonstrably wrong about black metal, but fucking whatever. It's mostly about his personal recollections of the old death metal scene and that kind of shit. So it's gonna get personal, but it also features a massive section at the end where he just goes over like pretty much everybody death metal and death metal adjacent from Sweden in the early to mid 90s, and Rosicrucian is in there. And according to him, Rosicrucian broke up due to lineup changes being like too much of an issue, and then a few members reformed a new band called Slapdash. Other sources that I read claim that they just didn't want to be on Black Mark Records anymore, which not too many bands did too well on Black Mark. I mean, obviously Bathory did well with them because it's his dad running the label, and then like Edge of Sanity did reasonably well there. You know, like Cemetery got pretty big, but for the most part, a lot of these older like Black Mark albums are out of print, and there's not a lot of good feelings between the bands and the label. And so the other theory I've seen floated is that they just wanted to get out of their contract, so they broke the band up and then immediately reformed as a new band called Slapdash. You know, and I'm looking at like the records of their lineup, and the only band member problems they had that I can see is that they just kept changing drummers a lot, but like the songwriting core was the same. So is Slapdash literally just a third album continuation of Rosicrucian, or is it a new entity? I would say honestly kind of both. On the one hand, it's still this sort of like groovy, groove thrash, fucking whatever metal that they've always been playing, but this one has like a much clearer influence from other groove metal bands of the era, specifically a whole lot of like Pantera and Prong and whatnot, which honestly wasn't really a big part of their sound back in the olden days. But on the other hand, like the second album was a little bit simpler and less death metal inflected than from the first one. You could see this as like the natural conclusion of that arc. To really look into whether or not this is like a major continuation of the old Rosicrucian sound or like a whole new sort of like weird alternative metal monster, you have to look at what made Rosicrucian famous. That of course being the heavy chug riffs and then the weird little like lead guitar bits kind of stitching the parts together, and they're still there. But they're not really doing the wacky solos anymore. Instead it's replaced with a lot of this more like alternative rock kind of noisy shit, like weird guitar pick scrapes and whatnot. And yeah, look, this dude's trying to be Phil Anselmo. I wish he wouldn't, because I thought he had his own unique voice. That weird fuzz bass is cool though. So yeah, I don't know if I can like fully recommend Slapdash as sort of like an honest continuation of Rosicrucian. It definitely feels like, you know, the elements are still there. Like this part right here is very old Rosicrucian-ish. This weird little atmospheric transition, but for the most part, it's like way more Pantera-ish, and it just doesn't really interest me as much as their older stuff does. Maybe I'm an old fogey, but then again, like, back when Rosicrucian was the thing, I was like fucking 2 years old. You know, I just don't like this kind of like alternative rock stuff. So Slapdash, kind of a disappointment for me. But those first two Rosicrucian albums are great. A lot of like thrash from this part of the world, like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, that kind of thing, is pretty heavily underrated because all those places had like giant fucking death metal and black metal scenes. But that Agony album I did way back on an old episode from Sweden, that's one of my favorite thrash metal albums. Stone from Finland did some really interesting kind of prog thrash right around the time Rosicrucian was doing their thing. And then even like other lesser known bands like Midas Touch and Hexenhaus over in Sweden are pretty cool. But Rosicrucian kind of stands above pretty much all of them for me except for Agony. Highly recommend those two Rosicrucian albums if you can find them. Like I said, they were on Black Mark, they're out of print. You probably have to download them. Sorry about that. Anyway, see ya.
Thank you for watching.
Fucking like, you know, like some like, I don't know, like.
Hey, look at that, the blue one in my tongue blew out. Look at that, I got Smurf tongue, sitting there eating up the lady Smurfs, Smurfettes of age pussies. Oh, that's horrible.